Chahut média.
The passport is the noblest part of the human being. Nor does it come into the world in such a simple way as a human being. A human being can come about anywhere in the most irresponsible manner and with no proper reason at all, but not a passport. That's why a passport will always be honored, if it's a good one, whereas a person could be as good as you like, and still no one takes any notice. Bertolt Brecht, Refugee Conversations, 1940.
You need a human for a passport, but without a passport, an identity document of any sort, a human is nothing. What a staggering thought.
By looking deeper into the issue of statelessness, I discovered that
Eva Volchold, Social Rights Program Director, Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Geneva.
So many issues, like from when you're born until you die, connected very intensely to a document that describes your identity, your passport, your ID, or whatever. And many services that for us who have those passports are very normal, like having a birth certificate, enrolling in the school, getting a health insurance, or finding a job, an apartment, or a bank account, or a mobile phone account, or and then until you die, like to have your death certified, are not possible if you don't have a passport.
My name is Anna Rasquet-Paz. I'm a journalist in New York City, and this is Citizens of Nowhere, 4-part series on statelessness, supported by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and produced by Chahut Media. Welcome to Episode 2, Invisible Borders.
If we take a kind of long historical view, statelessness is normal. Statelessness, in fact, is the norm.
Laura Robson, professor at Yale's Jackson School of Global Affairs and an expert in Middle Eastern history.
The experience of being attached through citizenship to a nation state is an experience that belongs no earlier than the 20th century in a real way. And so, when we think about statelessness, I think we need to think about it historically as less anomalous than we imagine now, right?
The very notion of being stateless wasn't a thing until, we made it a thing.
So if we think about pre-modern eras of history kind of across the globe, people's relationship with the state was attenuated, was not usually tied to rights in the way that we think about now. Mobility was in some ways more difficult in kind of practical and logistical ways, but in some ways easier in that you typically, didn't need papers, you didn't need a passport. There are not demarcated and enforced borders between states in the same way across the globe in pre-modern eras. So the issue with statelessness is that it arises simultaneously with the capacity of the modern state.
So statelessness used to be the default, and that makes sense because nation-states weren't the norm in the time of empires, which was any time really before the 20th century. But at some point, empires began to crumble. Laura Robson explains how we went through that transition.
I'm going to draw on the kind of Ottoman imperial experience, since that's the one that I know the best, but I also, because I think it is paradigmatic in some respects, for other imperial experiences. So the thing about empires is that they don't expect their subjects to all be the same, right? They expect that subjects will have different ethnicities, that they will practice different religions, that they will speak different languages, that they will identify with different nations, different nationalities, right? And that is, in fact, not just normal for empires, but also a kind of crucial part of how they operate, because they use those categories to interact with their subject populations. Now, it's important not to romanticize this, right? Because clearly there are hierarchies within those categories, right?
Right. Expecting nations to be different is not the same as expecting them to be equal.
In the Ottoman state, there are clearly certain categories that have greater privileges vis-a-vis the state than others. But there is no expectation of sameness, right? There's no expectation of homogeneity. One of the things that happens as these empires sort of begin to disintegrate and the idea of the nation state emerges, right? Where we have states that sort of, at least theoretically, require their subjects to profess the same nationality, where the borders of the state are going to be the same as the borders of the nation.
So here we need to explain a bit more how nation-states came about. This is Bronwyn Manby, a consultant and scholar, expert in nationality laws in Africa.
So every society in the world since we were Neanderthals, I assume, had an idea of who was one of us and who wasn't one of us, even in the time when communities might number 20 people. And that's uniform condition of all societies. But the idea of the state, and indeed the kind of nation state, so the state is made up of a group of people who somehow consist of something called a nation.
A state is a political organization. As Bronwyn Manby said, they became tied to nations, groups of people who are the same. Same ethnicity, same language, same culture. That's what humanity has been trying to make work for the last century or so. Except it's messy because, well, groups migrate, groups mix. Back to Laura Robson.
Once that begins to happen, empires start to become suspicious of these populations within their borders who do not fit with the dominant or the hegemonic nationality, right? And so in the Ottoman case, and in a number of other cases as well, one of the first indicators of kind of imperial disintegration is internal violence, right? That we start to see internal violence between these communities and the state sometimes. This certainly happens in the Ottoman sphere, for instance, vis-a-vis Armenians. And also in the Balkans, where we start to see the expulsion of Muslims into Anatolia in the course of the Balkan Wars in the 19th century, as things like Greek nationalism and Serbian nationalism take hold and attach themselves to Christian identifications.
Laura Robson is describing colonies of an empire seeking independence. This happened in every empire, roughly around the same time. The United States kind of started the ball rolling in the 18th century. Then places like Haiti, Mexico, Brazil followed suit. Greece's independence movement associated all Muslims with the Ottomans, who were the occupying power. By 1923, about 400,000 Muslims from Greece had been exchanged for 1.2 million Christians from Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. Great European powers and the brand new League of Nations approved that exchange. Empires atomized into smaller territories where the people shared land and culture. And in some cases, that meant ethnic cleansing. But in that moment, people were just trying to stay put, to not get displaced.
One of the things that comes up is a kind of new regime of documentary, evidence and paperwork and bureaucracies surrounding demonstrating people's capacity to leave or stay. So actually, the first place this comes up is with people who are trying to avoid deportation, who try to demonstrate that for whatever reason they should not be included in this exchange.
And by the way, this is about the time, around 1919, when refugee camps began to appear. What's interesting, Laura Robson says, is that they show up where prisoner of war camps are, like right next to them. But as nation-states appear, refugees are a problem.
Refugee camps have the purpose not necessarily just of offering humanitarian aid, although that is sort of one stated purpose that they have, but also of segregating refugees from their host society and keeping them in place until such time as the host state or the power over the host state has decided where they should go, right, or what should be done with them. So camps are internment spaces, right? I mean, I think we really need to remember this. This is not different now, right? This is the same. And that it's not a surprise, really, that they arise as a tool for kind of geopolitical order in conjunction with major military operations.
So these very first refugee camps are starting to pop up in the Middle East, and relief organizations are going around these camps asking people who they are, where they come from, what their story is. And the first identification documents start to appear. Quick parenthesis here. Like camps, identification documents have an origin in military history. Around the 1830s, the Ottoman Empire started to issue ID papers for men for the purpose of conscription. These documents included the year of birth, place of origin, profession, religion, a physical description when photographs didn't exist. Then there were passports. What happened in the Ottoman Empire is quite typical of what happened elsewhere, according to David Gutman, an historian at Manhattanville University. The empire was trying to centralize power, but for this, mobile populations had to stay in one place. So, they created a travel document and a system of migration control to prevent the exodus of Christians from Anatolia and what is now Lebanon. The Christians were leaving after sectarian conflict weakened the Ottomans' authority in those areas. More than anything, the empire were terrified of Western influence and the return of some of these immigrants who could seed political turmoil. They were also scared of looking bad abroad. And some of these Christians, the Armenians, were starting to make noises about independence. So they issued passports and tried to block comings and goings. And this documentary regime became even more powerful as nation-states appeared and created laws about who belonged and who didn't. Here's Bronwyn Manby.
A lot of the rules about nationality, in fact, evolved in the context of disputes between the United States of America and different European countries about whether the extent to which people who had naturalized as American were still German, for example, and could Germany, require them to do things. If they visited Germany, could Germany, arrest them and detain them, or would they be American, and therefore, America could exercise diplomatic protection on their behalf? Those types of questions. Many of the laws evolved in that context.
So then I wondered if the rise of nation-states was inevitable. Could there have been other models? Laura Robson says that people came up with other ideas, and most of them were versions of the imperial system.
I mean, there are lots of proposals. In the Middle East, it's interesting how, there is a kind of nostalgia for, but also kind of an interest in reworking, reforming concepts of Ottomanism well into the 20th century, right? And, quite a long time, in fact, after the actual fall of the empire, after its total disintegration in the aftermath of the First World War, people still have this idea that maybe it could be resurrected in some way, right? That there could be some new imperial formulation, that it would include Anatolia, would include the Arab lands, would, have the possibility of a kind of multi-ethnic, multinational, multi-religious even, imperial state.
A return to the good old times, basically.
The same thing happens in kind of the states that emerge out of the Habsburg Empire, right? These concepts of federalism, concepts of kind of other modernized forms of imperial statehood. These are ideas that persist, And then I think we also need to acknowledge that one of the great movements, one of the most important political movements of the 20th century in the form of communism, is also, at least theoretically, a non-national model, right?
I'd never thought of federalism as a remix of imperialism, but it makes sense. A large territory split into smaller units of land and people with a certain degree of autonomy. That's also what you see today in Spain with its autonomous provinces, and in Italy to some extent. The UK is made up of 4 countries, plus the United States. And Wait, communism?
So there are, and it has a lot of appeal in these spaces where empires have fallen apart, often into national models that are accompanied by a great deal of violence, right? So we should recognize kind of the reasons that some of these models of communist internationalism, of leftist internationalisms also have, carry a lot of appeal well into the 20th century.
And what's interesting here is that when the USSR fell apart in 1989, the moment those satellite Soviet republics became independent, well, that moment created more statelessness. Remember Alexis Ivashuk from last episode? He was born in Latvia. His family was part of those who lived there and were denied Latvian citizenship when the Soviet Union fell. That group included minorities, but also ethnic Latvians. Latvia could have chosen to follow the example of neighboring Lithuania, which passed the so-called zero-option law when it became independent in 1989. That law gave all permanent residents 2 years to decide whether they wanted to become Lithuanians, but Latvia did not. Instead, it created drastic requirements for citizenship. Anyone and the descendants of anyone who wasn't Latvian on the day Russia invaded the country in 1940 was denied a nationality. This is how Alexis became one of the 700,000 people in Latvia who found themselves without citizenship.
Doomed to repeat the same sort of historical atrocities and crimes against humanity.
Alexis Ivashuk, citizen of nowhere and founder of the Apatrid network.
And that should be the really disturbing part. And then it's worse for everybody. It's worse for the state actors, because the state actors will end up going to war, will end up going into conflicts.
An empire won't fall on its own. And as you can expect, they dragged their colonies into the morass that became the establishment of nation-states. What happened on the African continent is illuminating.
So, you cannot disentangle the history of nationality and statelessness in Africa from the history of colonization.
The colonial powers in Africa were Britain, France, to a lesser extent Portugal, Spain, Belgium, and Germany. Then the great powers confiscated African colonies from Germany as punishment for starting World War I and split them amongst themselves.
And so the colonial powers had rules about who belonged. At the international level, if you lived in a British territory or a French territory, you were British or French for the purposes of whether any other country could interfere and tell Britain or France what to do with you. So Britain and France were recognised, of course, by other European powers as being having a legal connection to the person. But of course, only a very small minority of people, almost 100% of them of white European descent, were citizens in the kind of full participatory social science sense of citizenship in those colonies.
The largest group of stateless people in Côte d'Ivoire consists of migrant workers who came to the country either voluntarily or by force, along with their descendants. During the colonial period, the Ivorian economy was dominated by plantations, and from the 1930s onwards, chiefly coffee and cocoa farms. The workforce needed to run the plantations was recruited both locally and elsewhere in the French colonial empire in West Africa, especially in what was to become Burkina Faso. An extract from the article for Coffee and Cocoa, Nicolas Libert, Atlas of the Stateless, 2020.
White Europeans were automatically citizens. Indigenous people, not so much. So when the empires fell and the Europeans went away, they left a mess.
At independence, when the European powers departed from the late 50s up until, depending on how you look at it, 1994, with South Africa becoming a democracy, but mostly in the 1960s, then you had to decide who was going to be a member of these newly independent states, and almost all of the situations in Africa of group statelessness. I mean, there are lots of individual stateless people, for example, who are orphans who don't know the origin of their parents and so forth. But the big situations of group statelessness date to this transition from the colonial era to independence, affecting especially people who moved or were moved forcibly by the colonial powers or during the imperial period, people who were labour on European plantations, for example, coming from what subsequently became a different country and whose status as members of the country where they had been left by the colonizers was never fully. That's repeated also in more recent state secessions, the term used when sovereignty is transferred. So the secession of South Sudan from Sudan, for example, a large number of people of South Sudanese descent who are living in Sudan considered not to be Sudanese, but also without any evidence of their claim to South Sudanese nationality. The same when Eritrea split from Ethiopia. A zone of previous free movement, then who belonged to which side, lots of intermarriage, lots of movement inside that territory. And of course, also resulting from the colonial borders, the fact that borders were drawn right through the middle of what had been previously existing polities, and so previous political ethno-cultural units had borders down the middle of them, and the status of people living in those border areas challenged as well.
The end of colonialism led to the independence of many countries and a new nationality for many of their inhabitants, but not for all. Some people were left stranded. Immigrants in the newly independent countries had no state that would accept them. That is the case of Karana, a minority group in Madagascar. Olivia Rajerson, Atlas of the Stateless, 2020.
With colonial powers gone, the nation-state model stuck. And it kept happening, again and again, producing each time more statelessness. And then there was World War II. The war began on the heels of mounting nationalism in Europe and elsewhere. Shortly after the concept of nation-states took hold, it became about defending these new borders, homogenizing the nations, pushing away undesirables. The Jews, who were citizens of the countries where they lived, were suddenly stripped of nationality, first in Germany and then across Europe. Jews were not the only ones. The world faced an unprecedented humanitarian crisis that left millions of survivors in legal limbo. Hannah Arendt, a German Jew who lived stateless for nearly 2 decades, wrote extensively about a key idea, that in the era of nation-states, a nationality was the condition to accessing human rights. In her mind and in the mind of many Jews, the need for a Jewish state became urgent.
Not only did the loss of national rights in all instances entail the loss of human rights, the restoration of human rights, as the recent example of the State of Israel proves, has been achieved so far only through the restoration or the establishment of national rights. Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951.
Hannah Arendt wasn't the only famous person to become stateless, by the way. Albert Einstein and the playwright Bertolt Brecht were in that lot. And the reality refugees had to face was sobering. World War II sent the world into chaos, forcing masses of people from their homes and the only countries they'd known, losing their citizenships and thereby their access to rights. Many roamed the planet with nowhere to go, unwanted, everywhere they went. The conflict reconfigured nation-states and led first to the foundation of the United Nations in 1945 and then to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Statelessness was such a massive problem The drafters included Article 15. Everyone has the right to a nationality. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality, nor denied the right to change his nationality. Because if you can't access the rights listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights unless a government claims you, then that declaration is hardly universal. David Baluarte of the CUNY School of Law emphasized how the aftermath of World War II created a convoluted legal situation for stateless people.
After World War II, as Europe was struggling with the reality of lots of displaced people after the war who didn't have nationality in the place where they were living, and because of lots of reasons related to persecution, prior persecution, fear of persecution, couldn't go back to wherever they were from. And so what you had was a large group of people that faced some mixture of these two challenges. And the UN at the time, wanted to resolve this situation broadly. And I think initially thought that they would resolve it together. They would create a refugee convention with like a supplemental document that helped understand the link between refugee status and statelessness.
It is the international agreements created in the aftermath of the Second World War that define what it means to be a stateless person and set the basic rules for living outside the boundaries of states and seeking entry into them. Mira Siegelberg, Statelessness, A Modern History, 2020.
And then we know from just observing history that ultimately what happened was two different regimes, two different frameworks came up that are essentially mirror images of each other, but are intended to capture these two groups. One got traction, refugee protection, and one didn't. And statelessness, sort of the idea, the legal protection, the definition, sort of fell into the shadows, like the people themselves. And so really they're two different ideas that are just linked in so many different ways. And so I think that, bringing it to the U.S. context, most of the stateless people that I've worked with in the United States have attempted to secure protection as refugees, because that's the only legal protection for someone in their situation broadly.
Statelessness was born of a series of humanitarian crises at a time when nation-states were beginning to draw their legal boundaries. And that's perhaps what has made the problem so forgettable. The fact that it touches on arcane nationality law on an international stage has kept it all quite fuzzy, something many governments have exploited to avoid doing anything about it. Bronwyn Manby again.
Yeah, nationality really is the kind of last bastion of state sovereignty. If you're thinking about the world through the lens of international human rights law, the degree to which the state has discretion to mistreat people, which was absolute up until the Second World War, and remains, of course, in practice pretty easy to do, but nonetheless, in theory, if you've signed up to most states have signed up to at least some of the international human rights treaties, in principle, your discretion to mistreat your own people is quite constrained. But when it comes to deciding who is your national, the constraints are more limited.
In other words, this gives governments legal cover to discriminate.
States consider that they've got the right to say who they think is who. And in particular, the access to nationality is very often a cover for racial discrimination, which otherwise would be completely prohibited.
But, as we'll see in the next episode, the biggest hurdle may just be that governments and the people who run them simply have no idea what statelessness is. Stay tuned for the next episode, A Struggle for Belonging. Statelessness, Citizens of Nowhere, a Rosa Luxemburg Foundation podcast series written and hosted by Anna Rasquat-Paz, edited and produced by Chahut Media.